Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all today to a publishing speaker series where we invite acclaimed authors and industry professionals to speak to the University of Winnipeg community and the public about their work and traditional publishing in today's climate. The series is made possible by funding from the University of Winnipeg and the English Department, and we are very grateful for their support. Today's event will feature acclaimed memoirist and professor Danielle Geller, moderated by our own Professor Celise Lipka. It's going to be a very exciting and powerful reading and conversation between two very brilliant individuals. And I'm so excited to hear about what goes on behind Danielle's work. This event will be recorded, so if you do not want to be filmed, please turn your video off. We also ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. We already have a lot of questions submitted, so we will only turn to the chat if there is time at the end. I would like to now introduce you to your moderator and my wonderful colleague. Celise Lipka, she, her, is Métis and assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, Treaty 1, teaching women's writing and Indigenous literatures. Her research explores storytelling and resurgence in Métis literature, as well as the anxious structures associated with gender and race in 20th and 21st century women's writing. Celise is currently working on a co-edited collection of essays with Dr. Aubrey Hansen at the University of Calgary on Métis literature by Métis scholars. She recently served as an executive member of the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, ILSA. Please welcome Professor Lipka, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. I wasn't expecting that longer bio. I feel so honored. I'm so happy and honored to be here. Before I introduce Danielle, I'm just going to take a moment to acknowledge where we are coming from and meeting from today. We're coming from different spaces across Canada, but because this is being hosted by the University of Winnipeg, the Department of English, I just want to acknowledge that the university sits in Treaty 1 territory, which is the territories of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, and the Ojibwe Cree nations, and of course the homeland of the Métis people. And our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nations in Treaty 3 territory. As I've already said, I'm so pleased to be here, and it's my honor to introduce for you today Danielle Geller. Her first book, Dog Flowers, was published by One World Random House in 2021. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker and Brevity. She teaches at the University of Victoria and is a faculty mentor for the low-res MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. So please join me in welcoming Danielle. We have our videos off, but you can use the clap emoji. It's just so lovely to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you all today, Lindsay. I'm very excited to be here virtually, if not in person. So we had talked about, I was going to start off with a short reading. And rather than reading something from Dog Flowers, I thought I would read something from the new project that I'm working on, which is an essay collection. And it's about a lot of things, but it is sort of structured around my relationship with video games. Video games which I've used as a coping mechanism throughout my whole life, but that has also gotten out of control. So I think it's going to be one of the most embarrassing things I ever write, writing about like the 6 years I spent playing World of Warcraft. But it's organized around 5 different genres of video game: adventure, role-playing, simulation, strategy, and survival games. And it sort of charts my sort of shifting identity as a social gamer and a competitive gamer, and now just a filthy casual gamer. But the essay I'll be reading from today is titled Adventure, and it is based on the game Colossal Cave Adventure. So, at 9:22 on a Thursday morning in August of 2010, I sent my dad an email about death that is now embarrassing to read. At the time, I was 24 and worked in the supply department of a thrift store in Boston, where I spent 8 hours a day sorting through and pricing other people's used clothes. I don't remember why I felt the need to write such a serious email in the middle of a workday, but I must have drafted it on our break room's orange couch. The email he sent me that preceded mine was innocuous. Subject, some lady called. He relayed a message from a woman calling me about a diabetic meter, obviously spam, but the true reason for his email came at the end. Wish you would call or write or something more often. In my initial reply, I made a lame joke about diabetes and my love of Pepsi. I apologized for not writing, and I tried to reassure him that I thought about him all the time. I mentioned a writing contest I entered, then described one of my weird dreams, one that starred Kelsey Grammer as a space hero who was supposed to fight aliens but spent all his time awkwardly hitting on women instead. I ended the email with a question. How have you been? Then, 20 minutes later, without waiting for his response, I sent him the embarrassing death email. Subject, since we always talk about dying. To be clear, he wasn't actively dying, but anytime I called home, all Grandma talked about was how sick and miserable he was. How he chain smoked in her living room, ate nothing but junk food, and rarely got off her couch. How he woke up every morning hacking out his lungs. This death talk wasn't new. My father started dying when I was in high school. He was dying throughout my years in college, my thrift store detour, and my first master's degree. He would continue dying through my second master's degree, the early years of my marriage, and my move to Canada. He would be dying when I sold my first book and when I accepted my first academic job. In the embarrassing death email, I compiled a list of things I wanted to say before he was gone. I loved him. I was never ashamed of him. I wanted him to be happy, and I wished I could buy him a house and set him up with a decent computer, a solid internet connection, and a library of video games. And I would try to do something good with my life. What I needed him to know, but didn't say, was that the eternal present of his death was killing me. Instead, I sent him a link to a video, which I claimed was the only thing that didn't make me cry. It was of an animated cat lip-syncing to Scatman John. Penelope Reed Dube, an academic with an awesome name, writes about labyrinths. She argues that labyrinths as metaphor and motif describe both the linearity and the architecture of space and time, by which I think she means they are inherently ambiguous and relative to one's perspective. She says that when it comes to labyrinths, there are two kinds of people. The first are maze treaders, those with limited vision who become caught in the labyrinth, confused and annoyed. The second are maze viewers, whose ability to perceive the labyrinth's pattern as a whole, its complex artistry, leads to dazzlement and revelation. I am a maze viewer, I want you to believe, but I am also, very often, a person at loss. At 3:31 on a Wednesday afternoon in September of 2020, a decade after the embarrassing death email, I received another message from my father. Subject, hospital test. In the body of the email, a single sentence. He wanted me to know he would be going in for a test on his liver. 6 weeks later, he would die. After he died, I went looking for him in one of the only places left to us. I grabbed my keys and a lamp, food and water, and entered the forest. You are wandering aimlessly through the forest, the guide told me as soon as I entered. You are wandering aimlessly through the forest, the guide told me as I walked north. You are wandering aimlessly through the forest, the guide told me, but I thought I'd keep following my original path for a while. You are wandering aimlessly through the forest, the guide told me, and I gave up and backtracked, walked east, south, west. I was aimless, the guide insisted. Did I want to be shown out of the forest? I answered yes, but the guide wanted to deduct 2 points from my score to reveal the path forward. I wasn't aware I had points at stake, but I knew I didn't want to lose them, so I told the guide to never mind and continued to wander, aimless. You might have guessed, but neither the forest nor the guide is real. Their devices in Colossal Cave Adventure, colloquially Adventure, a text-based game, the first of its kind. It was initially developed in 1976 by William Crowther, a computer programmer, one member of the small team that laid the technical foundations of the internet. He was also a rock climber and a caver, and Adventure's Cave is modeled after Kentucky's Mammoth Cave system, which he and his wife explored and mapped for the U.S. Park Service. In one story he told about their caving adventures, he described how his wife, after 6 or 7 hours of walking and crawling, wiggled through a small crack no one had entered before and made a discovery that joined Mammoth Cave with another cave system, a discovery that turned Mammoth Cave into the world's longest labyrinth. According to the U.S. Park Service's website, an estimated 600 miles is yet unexplored. Around the time of Adventure's release, my dad worked as a field service technician for his older brother's computer company, and he played the game on the mainframe computers he serviced after hours. It was one of his favorites, though I wonder now how much of that was nostalgia. In the decades since, programmers have created emulations of the game that can be played anytime, anywhere. But I wanted more than an emulation. I craved an authentic experience of the game my father remembered. My quest led me to Living Computers Museum and Labs in Seattle, and though it closed to the public during the pandemic, I could access their video game library remotely, and the game I played would run on one of the museum's mainframe computers, the Toad 2. I tried to play the game remotely 3 separate times. The first time, you may have gleaned, I got nowhere. But I wanted the guide to understand I am not aimless. I am not the type of person to become lost in a forest, but the game's logic doesn't work like mine. There was no sun in the sky to orient me. There were no birds in the forest, no squirrels, no deer. There was no sound except for the mechanical click of my fingers on the keys. Adventure wanted me to be lost in the forest, so I was lost. And to be unlost, I would need to find a destination I could not see from where I stood, lost in a forest. The second time I tried to play Adventure, I wasn't able to connect to Living Computer's system, and I emailed the staff for their advice. Stephen Jones, the museum's senior manager of restoration, maintenance, and engineering, responded almost immediately to let me know the Toad 2 was back online, and he offered to answer any questions I might have. I asked him if he knew much about the history of the PDP-10, which he did, and we scheduled a follow-up call. During our call, I told him my dad had been a field service engineer, and I wanted to know what that job might entail. He explained that field techs often performed preventative services on machines, which seemed to mostly involve checking air filters. They were often asked to take drives on and offline. The disk drive was the size of a top-loader washing machine, and when you opened one, it would be exposed to dust, which reduced the heatsink in fan performance and could lead to a disk crash, the worst-case scenario. They make a heck of a lot of noise, Stephen Jones laughed. I told him my dad had never beaten Adventure. Even though it was a simple text-based game, it had enough memory to interfere with the normal operation of business, and my dad was asked to wipe it from the company's mainframe after a system check betrayed its presence. Stephen Jones told me there was another way companies restricted access to Adventure during working hours, a mechanism that let people play the game after 5 p.m. or overnight, but at the start of the workday, you would only see the message, "The dungeon has closed." After our call ended, I messaged my father's oldest brother, his former employer, and asked if he would be available to talk. I wanted to ask him a few questions, though I didn't really know what I wanted to ask. This was a mistake, I knew in my heart. But my uncle agreed, and the day of our conversation, his wife called me on FaceTime. She warned me that my uncle was hard of hearing, then handed him the phone. He had my dad's hair and cheeks and nose. I just wanted to ask you a couple questions about my dad, I said. He looked annoyed. Your dad was a drunk and an addict, and he killed himself, he yelled across the Pacific. What more do you want to know? My husband darted out of the bedroom where he had been napping. What the fuck was that? Just my family, I said, ending the call, which had only lasted 3 minutes by Facebook's timestamp, though I cried much longer than that. When my dad responded to the weird death email a day later, he didn't address much of what I had said. He told me he wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail, and he sent me a link to someone's travel blog. He was sick of the computer and the internet, and if it didn't kill him, it might cure him. I will be what I was before all this, he wrote. It would be cold soon, I warned him, and I told him to try walking south. The third time I played adventure, after an indeterminable amount of time spent walking, I stumbled onto a new location, a stream within a valley. Downstream, the water disappeared into a 2-inch slit in a rock. Here was a puzzle, one I was too annoyed to solve. I walked instead upstream, where I found myself back where I began, standing at the end of a road facing a brick well house. Around me, the forest. Thank you.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. That was really lovely. I don't know if this is a good question or a question even I'm allowed to ask, but can you tell us a little bit about like when this essay collection is coming out? Does it have a title yet? Or those, is that a bad question to ask an author? Maybe it is.
Yeah. Nothing is official, but the current timeline is I get the final draft done next December, and then it'd be about a year before it is published and available.
So exciting. Well, I mean, I have a little bit of a wait, but that's okay. I can do it. It's going to be so good, and I can't wait to read it when it comes out. So thanks so much for sharing this early work with us.
Yeah.
Very, very nice. I guess we can shift over into some questions, although I really want to talk a lot about the piece that you just shared with us. And a lot of the questions that I have are more general questions. So I'm going to try and like weave some things in.
Yeah.
But the first question, maybe I'll start with, is a more general question. Thinking about telling personal stories. So for BIPOC writers, memoir, personal narrative is often a very fraught genre, but one where you can truly be seen. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk about some of the benefits and possible downsides to publishing your personal narratives, whether that be in memoir or essay form, now that you're kind of working in both genres, and what advice you have for BIPOC writers who want to publish their personal stories.
Yeah, that's I think a really good question. When I first started writing Dog Flowers, I thought that I was writing about my mother. And then one of the things that you realize when you are writing memoir, hopefully, is that no, you're not actually writing about other people, you're writing about yourself. And that was something that I really resisted for a long time because I didn't see myself as a protagonist. I really saw myself in conversation and in relation to not just my mother, but so many other people in my family. And I think that's one of the limitations of contemporary memoir as a genre, is that it's very focused or centered on the individual. And like that's kind of what readers expect from memoir. They want to see that character arc. They want to see the narrator grow and change. And a lot of times, the reader also expects the writer to have been healed or saved or for everything to be okay at the end. Okay or better, right? Healed. And that isn't the way life works. And especially for me, it wasn't just my story that I was trying to, like, not even resolve, but just come to terms with almost, or to understand. What I wanted was to understand all of these really complex dynamics in my relationships within my family and all of these complex feelings I had about my mother. Um, and so I think just generally memoir and the audience expectations can be a really difficult place to write about those kind of complicated relationships and emotions. And for BIPOC writers, I think that that community aspect or that family aspect, that this idea of like communal memory and story, it can be very hard to try and fit that into the more traditional form or expectations of memoir.
Yeah, I was just sitting here, I was like, yes, yes, especially because I was thinking too, these expectations are really rooted in like a Western sense of like the rise of the individual, right? Of like this maybe hero kind of narrative for your protagonist in a memoir who you want to root for. But yeah, this sense that it is just your story, but the community is so integral to who you are and the thoughts that you have. Yeah, so thank you so much for that. I think this next question goes really well with it because you were talking about thinking how to write yourself as a character. So in creative nonfiction, so much about of it is about curating a distinct narrative persona. So how did you decide on a literary persona when writing your memoir or your essays? How did you distinguish between character versus narrative voice in the book? And if a student is struggling with cultivating a literary voice, what advice might you give them for that?
Yeah, I don't think it was something that I was doing consciously for most of the time. But one of the what was important to me when I first started writing Dog Flowers, was I was my first degree or like my first vocation or dream was that I was going to be an archivist. And I was in library school when my mother passed away. And when I inherited, what she had left to give me, which was like her diaries and her photos and her letters, um, I really did approach them through this lens of the archivist, where I was like, okay, when I finally was able to open the suitcase that had all of her stuff in it, I was like, okay, and I'm transferring this to a banker's box. And I have my manila folders and I have my pencils, and I'm just going to like organize it and then tuck it away again. And it gave me this more, I think, objective lens or perspective that allowed me to be more critical about my family dynamics and to question some of the things I had been told about my mother, but also myself and what my role in the family was as a caretaker. So one of those perspectives that I like, one of those pieces of my character in Dog Flowers was this: I am an archivist. Another piece was like I am a daughter in that perspective. I am a caretaker, and what does that mean? I am a birder. And so that's where you start seeing like these birds coming onto the page. And the gamer identity was certainly there, but it wasn't as big or as important as it will be in my next book. Um, and so those identities were all what went into me, the character on the page. And what I needed to do was, I'm a very serious person. I'm a very morbid person. Um, and and I had to keep reminding myself to not be so serious about everything and to make fun of myself when I was being a little bit like dramatic or ridiculous. And I think that helped me sort of like even out my voice so that it wasn't always just like death and darkness. It was also like maybe we just like take a step back and put things into perspective.
I wanted to go in a different direction with the next question, but something that you just said really connected for me because I was trying to take notes while you were giving your reading. And as you were talking about the two different types of people who like encounter labyrinths or like how they encounter them, and you were talking about like this frustration and dazzlement. instantly in my mind, it took me back to dog flowers and thinking about your mother's possessions. And so there's something about the labyrinth and like the archiving of her possessions that like seemed very similar to me, like this idea of puzzles and archives and mapping and navigating, which is also something that comes up when you're playing the game, right? And you're lost in the woods. I don't have a specific question, but I'm just like wondering, I don't like this. We're getting a little bit of a glimpse into how I am in the classroom when I'm noticing themes, and I'm just like taking things and trying to put them together. But is that something that you do see kind of like a connection for in terms of your framework or that lens that you're using when you're coming to these larger questions about, I don't know, how do you kind of move through different pieces of your life, because it seems connected to me. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I think one of the ways that my brain works is kind of through like by association. Like sometimes I think I'm late to understanding what feels like is obvious to a lot of other people. But I find myself, I have a really hard time just coming out and stating like an opinion, like this is this thing. Because I never believe, like I don't have any belief or any faith in absolutes. I don't have any convictions because my mind is always changing, right? And some of the research I've been doing for my current book is into this theory or phenomenon of emergence in complex systems, and the way that the human mind loves to seek out patterns and make sense of things. And you look at coincidence, you look at recurring events, you look at for me, I meet a person and that person reminds me of someone else, and so I start layering like the past person onto the present person, even when like that isn't sort of a fair or accurate thing to do. And so, my mind is here, lining up all of these like pieces of information to say like, here, like this is what you are looking at. And then I do a lot of work of untangling that, right? It's like, okay, well, that is like this thing, but how is it not? I'm kind of rambling.
You are doing great.
But I think it's, a part of after I got married and I'm in this relationship with, one of the first healthy relationships of my life. And we're very, very, very different people. But one of the sources of conflict is when he will do something or say something. I'm like, well, that's just like, and I'll be like, my dad, or like this other person who had hurt me in some way. And he would get his feelings hurt. He's like, well, I'm not that person. I'm like, I know you're not, but this happened, this happened, this happened. I'm like, and now you are my dad, even though you're nothing like my dad. And so having to walk myself back and break some of those associations is part of my life and my thinking, but also my rating.
I see that in dog flowers too, that layering that's happening there. Also, I'm very, very interested in this, and I'm hoping we can talk about this more at a different time because it'll take up the whole conversation. But I'm like, yes, I need to talk about this more too, because I think it's so fascinating and I want to know more about this research. I think maybe that this is a good kind of moment to ask the question about your movement from the genre of memoir to personal essay. So thinking about, what does the personal essay kind of offer for you as a writer that perhaps memoir didn't? What does memoir maybe lack in terms of format or ability to, I don't know. For me, I'm thinking maybe like a question, like if there's a central question of the personal essay, as opposed to like the memoir form, where you mentioned before you thought you were writing a story about your mother, but as you're writing that, you're like, oh no, this is about me too, or both of us, or the whole family, right? So yeah, that difference from memoir form to personal essay, and maybe what are the benefits or disadvantages that you're finding as you're writing in this new form?
Yeah, I actually think I've always been an essayist, and then I took a wrong turn and wrote a memoir. And now I'm back to doing the thing that I actually am good at. Dog Flower started as a memoir. I started writing it after my mom passed away, and I wrote it really fast. I had like 80,000 words on the page after a couple of months of just obsessively writing it. And then I got accepted to grad school. I was like, this is gonna be easy. Look, I already have like most of the book written. And then it wasn't. It wasn't at all. And there I sort of thought about and experimented with turning dog flowers into an essay collection because I was having a really hard time figuring out like what is the central plot, what is this like longer journey that I am on, because there were so many things happening and so many sort of ideas and worries and questions that were pushing on that the central narrative. But when I was submitting the book to editors and talking with editors about how they saw dog flowers coming together, the editor that I ended up working with was very invested in the memoir. And so I was working with her to try and put this book together. And it was really hard. And I found structuring it especially really difficult. And the structure didn't come together until a month before I had to get her the manuscript. So now that I'm back working with essays, I'm having a lot more fun and it's feeling a lot more intuitive. And I think that with an essay, I can give myself sort of a constrained question or a constrained problem, and then I can get as big as I want with it and go down all my weird little rabbit holes and then pull it, like rein it back in. But with a memoir, I kept finding myself, I'd start editing it, I'd get, a couple chapters in, I'd be like, oh wait, hold on, no, like now I know, I understand where I'm going. I go back to the beginning. And so my editor kept, trying to be like, hey, the beginning is fine. What if you worked on the end of the book? So that's sort of where I am right now.
I mean, I agree. I love the beginning of Dog Flowers. It's so good. Um, and I, okay, I'm getting my own questions kind of mingled in here, but I wonder maybe if, do you think that the memoir came so fast at first because it is kind of emotional work, right? Like, so you kind of like, you're doing all kind of thing, and then afterwards when you're like, oh no, like there needs to be a narrative here, going back and like putting up the structure of what you feel. um do, or maybe something else, was it something else that, do you think that that switch was difficult
Yeah,
for?
so I write about this a little bit in Dog Flowers, and I'm writing about it a lot more in my next book. But I do have bipolar disorder, and it's something that I wasn't treated for a really long time because hey, the United States and terrible healthcare. And there was also this sense of like, well, if you're just in a thrift store, nobody really cares if you're going crazy every once in a while, if that makes any kind of sense. So when and one of the things that can be difficult about living with bipolar disorder is that I like to think that I'm good at handling stress. But actually my brain is not very good at handling stress. And so it reaches this critical point where I'm kind of like, okay, what do I need to do to get through this moment in time? And and that sort of like leads into this hypomania where I can do anything, everything is a good idea. And I can, work all day, all night, and until I kind of crash. And so after my mom passed away and I reached this critical point, that's when I was able to start writing. And then that's all I was doing. I was working on this book until I sort of wore myself out and got incredibly, incredibly depressed. So I really had to change as I've um, gotten now that I'm like, my mental illness is being treated and I'm finding new ways to cope with life's many different stresses. I've had to find a new way to enter my work because that sort of like obsessive, frenetic way of just obsessively, working on an essay isn't really my relationship with it anymore. And so now I'm much better at scheduling time and sort of working at a slower but more consistent pace. Um, and and it is, I do have to sort of go slow because it is very emotional work. And you can't always live in that space. You can't live in that space for a really long time. I think that was another difficulty I had with dog flowers was anytime I went back into it, um, I was retreating from the world, where I'm like, "Don't look at me, don't talk to me."
Mhm.
Like, I'm just pretend I'm not here as long as I'm in this space.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Uh, it's so illuminating, I think, to hear that part of the story for you. Also, it's a reminder for me why I should not deviate from questions. So I'm like, sorry if that was
No,
stressful
no,
for
no,
you
I
at
know.
all. But I'm just like, oh man, that was really like I'm just thank you so much for sharing that. I remember reading too that because I like starting some writing myself, like been told so many times, like, if it's the difficult scene, don't write it for more than half hour. Give yourself half hour and then you have to like put it down. But like for taking care of yourself and things like that. But when you're in the thick of it and you're writing, we don't always take care of ourselves the way that
Yeah,
perhaps we should be, right? And
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I'm glad that that shift has happened in a way that's working really well for you. So that's good to hear. Yeah. Um, this question, I think, is kind of related because it is thinking about um, the harder aspects of personal narrative for us as writers, right? So, as nonfiction writers, how do we grapple with what stories we can tell and the ethics of representation of one's community? How can we balance our relationship to truth telling and sensitivity while being committed to our artistic vision of a work? And I have a follow-up question, but I'll let you start with that.
Yeah, no, totally. I also wanted to say, like, don't feel like you have to apologize for asking the question. Mental illness is really stigmatized, and I don't, um, there aren't many things I'm uncomfortable talking about, but especially with mental illness, I think it's really important for, um, people to talk about, especially bipolar disorder in a way that isn't just, like, oh, like mania is like you're crazy, like it's not, um, it isn't always how it's presented on TV or in movies. Um, but that connection of how did I decide what stories I was able to tell? Part of it was, the very first draft, I was just writing everything down. It didn't matter who it was about, it didn't matter what it was about. I just let myself write it. Um, but, who I would like the stories I was telling and how I was telling them, there wasn't like a blanket rule I gave myself. It really was negotiated with the people that I was writing about. And so with my mom, I knew she had passed away and she wasn't there to speak for herself. And so, how did I write about her and our conversations and what I was finding in her diaries and her journal, like her letters and stuff? In a way that, I didn't, betray if you do what I didn't wanna betray her. And Sharon Olds actually she calls it, like, the spectrum of loyalty and betrayal. And it's a spectrum because, you do have to negotiate that with all of your relationships, but what she says is that to say nothing, is to betray yourself. To remain silent is to betray yourself. Um so for my mother, I knew she wouldn't want me sharing a lot of the things that I was writing. I knew that she had stayed silent and kept some things to herself for a reason. But for me, sharing some of those stories and sharing our relationship uh, was doing some of that unsilencing. Like very like painful and unhealthy silences that sort of erode not just my family, but families who are in similar situations or have similar dynamics. But with my sister, there were parts of her story that I knew but didn't know, or that conflicted with my own memories. And a lot of people don't show their work to the people that they're writing about, but I do, especially because preserving that relationship was really important to me. And so even when I was writing those very first drafts, I was sending them to her in the mail. Um, and when I had the final draft, I sent it to her, and not that I was going to necessarily cut anything that she didn't want to appear, but that I wanted to make sure I wasn't misrepresenting her in any way. And when it came to things that I wasn't present for or that felt like hearsay, that's when I would sort of lean on research to try and piece things together, whether it was like text messages or emails, or in one case, I actually went to sort of public court documents because it was this really private, very like tense, very complicated legal situation. And I didn't want to overly expose her. I didn't want to sort of like raise things for the other people that were involved. And so I was just like, you know what? Whatever is already public, whatever is or can be already known or discovered, that was what I was limiting myself to when it came to writing it.
So my follow-up question to that was thinking about it, not only just in writing, but in the photographs, because the photographs in the memoir are, I actually don't even know how to describe the impact that those photographs have on me, right? Because there's a lot of tension between what's happening on the page and then the representation of the photos, that paint like a new facet to, I mean, I know they're your real family members, but thinking about them as characters, right? Like there's so much that gets revealed in those photographs. And so do you feel the same way about the inclusion of that from the writing, or does it seem to, what other textures, I guess, does it kind of reveal for you?
Yeah, the photos that I include throughout the book, and they're like in these different sections, reflect what is happening in like the chapters before you get to those photographs. And the ones that I chose to include were often pieces of my mother's past, like that had changed or altered or shifted the way that I thought about something or remembered something. So I was being very selective about which ones I included. Um, and then I was also aware that um, sometimes when I read a book and they include family photos, often I'm like, oh, that's nice. Or like, oh, that's a person and I don't know who they are. And I didn't want I didn't want to just have like photos in there to have photos in there. So that's actually where I leaned into the archivist voice and was like, okay, what context do people need to understand not just like what this photo is, but also why I've included it, what I am seeing or not seeing, what I have like come to know through this photograph or through, I think I scanned a couple of letters and stuff.
Yeah, your notes, like your archival notes beneath the photographs, or the pictures that you drew as a child too, which, that also gives like another side for you, for us as readers, right? Yeah, those are fascinating. Are you having like any other um, kind of inclusions in your essay? Like maybe not photographs, but are you thinking about adding that kind of archival narrative as well into the collection of essays?
So far, not so much. I mean, I'm doing some of the same work of, in that essay, I include these emails that I have back and forth with my dad. I'm not like, I'm not a graphic artist, even though I would really like to write a graphic memoir. I can't draw. I'm not good with color. So that poses a little bit of a problem. but I have tried to figure like, oh, could I include screenshots? Are there ways that I could sort of pull that that medium of expression onto the page? And I'm playing with it, but I'm not sure that it's working yet or that it will continue to be there.
Well, I'm excited to see. I just think that it works so lovely in the memoir, and I understand that's a different genre and it's a different project that's working there. But I think we really see that part of your characterization as an archivist come through in such a really well, obviously front and forward because it's right there, it's on the page, right? But the juxtaposition of what's happening there adds so much dimension to the overall memoir. I'm trying to like scan my questions to be like, okay, what's the
Sure.
next one that makes like sense to this? I feel like you've already answered this question a little bit, but maybe bringing it back in and the specificity would help for some of the students who are working on similar kinds of things. So, um, in the memoir, you portray so much complexity and I thought about the relationships between the character's mother, sister, and aunt. And we see this in the essay too when you're talking to your uncle, right? There's still like these relationships that are happening. And we're wondering about how you can craft these relationships with so much texture and nuance. Could you describe the process for us? How much techniques, fiction techniques, do you use, or things that are more geared toward creative nonfiction?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is really important for me is to write the people I'm sort of standing in relationship with on the page, whether it's, family or my friends or even like people that I don't know, um, to portray them through as like many angles or lenses as I can. So when I'm writing about my dad, it isn't just the way that I see him, it's the way that my mother saw him because she had a very different idea of who he was as a person, the way that my grandmother saw him, which again was very, very different, the way that he came across in email, which, we could have conversations over email that we couldn't have face to face, or even on the phone. And I really am kind of obsessive in the way that I document my life. Not my life really, but when it came to my family, because our interactions could be so like disconnected in time and space that when I would have some of these conversations, I would just be like writing them down as they went. Partly because like there'd be things that he would say to me, or like my mom would say to my sister, like, this is ridiculous, right? Like, is this real? Like, can I, if I have sort of like this out of reality experience later and I can come back and look at what was said to me just to reaffirm almost like, yeah, you're not crazy. You didn't like that is how that conversation went. Um, and so that actually does give me, it feels like it gives me a lot of material to work with, but it's also, I'm able to go back to those conversations when I'm not feeling so emotional or I'm not blinded by whether it's like anger or fear or sadness or hopelessness that I can come to it with from a different emotional standpoint too, and think more critically about it.
Yeah, that's so great. And then you have your own little archive that you can kind of pull from. Um, and of course, like your mother, you have your mother's archive as well in the book, right? So like her, I don't I don't know if it's necessarily a similar desire or drive that had her writing those notes, but it's interesting to think about her archive against your archive, moving back and forth. And the conversation that comes from that, right? That couldn't be done in other ways, and now there is that conversation, which is
Yeah.
really, it's quite lovely. Yeah. I'm also noticing the time. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, how do we only have 9 minutes left? What is what is going on here?" So I feel like maybe I should get back to some more technical questions. This last one is thinking about audience and readers for aspiring writers. So the question is, should aspiring writers be thinking about the audience, about how their work will be perceived while working on drafts, or is this something to worry about later? So many of our students worry about what happens after publication. And this is, I think, a question from Lindsay, and she says, I remember reading an interview for you where you discussed the letters that were sent to your sister in prison, which became the first draft of the book. Were you conscious of audience at any time during the writing and revision of the manuscript?
That's a good question. Also, what you said earlier reminded me, where you're but basically where you're saying that having my mother's archive there, it was like I was in conversation with her. Edwidge Danticat, who wrote a beautiful memoir, Brother, I Am Dying. More recently, she published a book with Grey Wolf with the title "The Art of Death," which I really like. But in that book, I can't remember if it was Edwidge Danticat that said it, or if she was quoting someone who said it. But the idea was that that after death, the dialogue between those two people becomes a monologue. And I think when I was writing Dog Flowers, and now like when I'm writing this next book, I'm not ready for that monologue. Like I really do, what I am looking for is trying to continue that conversation with the people that I love, and try to like come to, like, again, not resolution, but try to almost like walk through what some of those conversations could have been, or that I wanted them to be, but that we never really had. But then that question about audience, and was I thinking about an audience? I think I was, but not in the initial drafting. I was thinking about audience when I was going back to revision and editing. And I wasn't imagining one audience, right? Like I really was thinking about, who could be reading this, who could be entering this space with me. And there's this one chapter where I'm writing about skinwalkers. And I think I even acknowledge up front where it's like, well, if you're Danae, like you might not want to read this chapter. But if you're like a white person who isn't that scared of skinwalkers, then come on in. But I think it is becoming a one of the things that is a bigger concern for my essay collection is I am writing for gamers, or like I know that probably a good portion of my readership or my audience are going to be people who like games and people who play games. But then there's also going to be people reading the book who don't know games at all. And so like one of the tricky things for me has been, okay, well, how do I write about the game's mechanics, or like the way that it works, without boring the gamers and without getting like too into the technical weeds for the people who aren't as familiar with that, gaming, video games. And it's hard. But it is something that this time it's not part of the revision and editing process. It really is part of that upfront drafting process.
Yes, that's something that I wouldn't have thought of as being something that's necessary, like while you're going through the process. But I'm like, yes, of course. Like I'm telling you now, I will be reading the collection of essays, and I'm not a gamer unless like early like Nintendo 64 still counts, like Super Mario Brothers. Like I like that I can, and I'm terrible at it. I die all the time when I'm playing Mario Kart right away. But yeah, just the navigating the difficulties of language and vocabulary for people who are like in the know of that group that you are talking to, and those who aren't, right? Yeah, that's such a tricky but important thing to be mindful of, because otherwise I would imagine if you do get to the editing process having not thought of that, that's going to be a big component of what your revision will be.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. Should we sneak in another question? We've got like 4 minutes. Like
Sure.
sneak in, yeah. So these ones are directly from the students. So I'm going to combine two questions here. So it's how did you decide which period of your life was something you were interested in writing memoir for? And then I guess when you're thinking then about that time span, how did you choose which details were important and which were less important?
Yeah, that's a hard I think that, was hard for me as I was writing Dog Flowers, and it contributed to some of the difficulty I had figuring out the structure. Um, because writing that book began with my mother's death. Um, but so the book kind of begins there, but my relationship with my mom did not. And so one of the very first threads I had was I get a call about my mom being in the hospital, and I fly down to South Florida, and then I'm only there for a couple of days. But that period of time, for how short those days were, felt like an eternity. And then there were a couple of other significant events, especially going back to the reservation for my mother's memorial service and meeting a lot of her family for the first time. Here's this other period that is super important or relevant. And then there's my dad, who, even though he and my mom hadn't been together for decade, like more than a decade, yeah, like way more than a decade. Even though they had been together, after she passed away, he was having a really hard time, and he came up and he stayed with me in Boston. And we didn't talk about it, but it was sort of like the emotional undertone for the entire time that he was there. Um, and so there were these like big obvious moments that felt important to the book. Um, but the thing I struggled with most was, you know, how do you find the ending? And every once in a while, I'd be like, oh, this happened. This is the ending. For a while, I thought the ending was, and I get into an MFA program and I move to Tucson and I have nothing. And it's just like my clothes, this weird stool I inherited from a former roommate, and then my mother's stuff. And it's just these suitcases sort of lined up in my closet. But then I was like, "Wait, no, that's not actually the ending." And then, like, I kept having those moments where I'm like, "Is this the ending? Is this the ending?" Um, and what ended up happening was I had all these little endings, towards the end of the book, and part of that was, there isn't one resolution, there isn't one, like, final moment where I'm like, "Okay, for me, the protagonist, this is the end of my journey." There were all these other endings and all of these almost like beginnings.
Yeah, that really comes through too, right? We have these little vignettes at the end that are like mini endings, even though, of course, we know that the story is continuing on and there's other things, but it does kind of have that sense of completion for that moment. And then all these lovely vignettes that together build this really strong and powerful ending, I think. Okay, that was lovely. I feel I feel like I could talk to you for another hour. Lindsay will be like, "Okay, it's time to turn this off and let everybody go." But just everyone, please join me in thanking Danielle so much for giving us that great reading and sharing so much information and words of wisdom with us. Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you. It was nice meeting you all, or your black screens.
Lindsay, did you want to say anything to wrap us up, or?
And just very briefly, I just want to say that was just such an amazing and powerful conversation. I really learned so much about memoir and just writing in general, just from listening and observing. And I took so many notes while you were speaking. And
Good, I'll
Danielle,
have to borrow them after.
and thank you so much, Danielle, for taking time today to join us. And thank you so much, Elise. That was so wonderful. And of course, thank you everyone in the audience for attending. And if you are in my workshop, we are going to meet again at 3:45 in our regular Zoom meeting. Otherwise, if you're not in my workshop, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. All
Happy
right.
Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday. Thank you.
So long.